Hey everyone, go ahead and take a seat, like a real seat for a real amount of time. Those who don't know me, my name is Maddie. I get to be one of the pastors here at Epiphany Station, and I get to take us where God has brought us so far and then lead us into a conversation right now regarding what it means for us to be the church. We've been walking this summer through this letter called 1 Peter. And 1 Peter is a letter that is written to the church to help them understand what it's actually going to look like to love God and to love people. Like in the midst of all the things, what's going to happen. He says lots of things about being wary of the world that you live in. The things that you're going to experience within that world are not going to look like you want them to look. And as those things happen, he appeals to us to be wise. To be wise in our response to these things that are going to happen. And so we're really close to the end of this letter in 1 Peter, because whether we want it or not, we're also really close to the end of summer. And at the end of it, the thing he appeals for is the church to not settle for something less than actually being the church. The church that Jesus Christ said would be the thing that we need after he was gone. That he put all the stock and planning in. That God designed this thing we call church. We struggle to let it live up to its name. We struggle to allow it to fulfill the real goal and to live up to the potential of what we need it to be. When we talk about church, we often talk about events happening. We talk about worship services, or we talk about this, we talk about that, we talk about music or a message or a pastor, and those things are not the point of church. What we're doing right now is not actually the driving force and reason behind the church. And so I want us to spend time finding out what is. To unashamedly look and see what is it that God desires when he says, this is what I have crafted the church to do and for it to be. It's our chance to talk about a community, a group of people that are actually connected. People that are interwoven, mutually dependent, that you can look at a handful of people and say, those are my people. That's my church, where I am known and known by them, and I know them, and they care for me, and I care for them. To be able to do that, we have to bring all of our misgivings about church, and our doubts about church, and our bad experiences of church, and we have to bring them alongside some trust that God has a desire for his church. We have to bring them alongside some expectations that it's not going to be perfect, and that there's actually a need for the church to be what it's supposed to be. I think if we're willing to do that, we can actually be the church of Jesus Christ as he intended it to be. And so we're in 1 Peter chapter 5, and we're starting in verse 1, going through verse 4. This is how Peter starts off. He says, "And now, a word to you who are elders in the churches. I too am an elder and witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I too will share in his glory when he's revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you'll get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor." When Peter talks church, the first thing he does is he talks to those who are in charge of the church. And the reason that I say in charge of the church is because what Peter's going to address and what we have to combat is that maybe potentially we think that some of us are in charge of the church. We think that we get to lead a church a place it's not supposed to go. And so Peter here appeals to elders. Those are those older in the faith, mature in the faith. You look at their lives and they're not ostentatious about it, but their quiet obedience to God and their trust through Jesus Christ can't help but publicly manifest something about them that shows that there's kind of proof to what they say and what they say they believe. He's talking to them who would have and choose to have any sense of spiritual responsibility over others. And he says, with high expectation, don't screw it up. He says to them, hey, guess what? I'm one of you, you're one of me, we're elders in the church. Don't be undercutting the reputation of church leadership. Here's what I need you to do and focus on. Care. Care for those who are entrusted to you. Care for them like God has entrusted their souls to you. Care for them like they have chosen to put themselves under your care. So those he talks to who are in charge, care is the primary word and the word most used in this chunk. Peter had to say this to the elders of the church for a good reason, and you kind of know the reason. It's not the easiest thing for that to keep going. For church to be a place where those who are in spiritual authority care. What happens is a game starts to get played, which God's people have always tried to do, is when God says do something, we say, yeah, but do we have to do it that way? Like, do we have to do it in its entirety? Do we have to do it fully? You start to ask questions like, you say to care for a person, but how long do I have to care? And you say to care for a person, but do I have to care for them if they do this? What if they don't do what I tell them? What if they struggle with sin? What if the years of walking away from you come out in some really ugly behaviors? Can I kind of put them in a different category where I don't have to care? Or maybe I don't have to care that they're first walking in the door. Or maybe I don't even have to care that some aren't through the door yet. And what happens is we remove the word care from leadership and we start to come up with different words. We can't start to say, like, I'm not here to care for you. I'm here to steer you in the right direction. I'm not here to care for you. I'm here to rebuke you. I'm not here to care for you. I'm here to correct you. Anyone ever says that, they're not doing what we're supposed to do. Those things can happen, correction, rebuke, these things can happen, but the actual goal is that you would care for those entrusted to you, for all of your failures and flaws and downfalls and pitfalls. So that's why Peter has to say what he says, goes into quite detail of how difficult it is and what can take the place of good care. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly. Not for what you'll get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. There's bad care and there's good care. The first sign of bad care is when a person doesn't want to do what they're doing. They don't want to care. They've been told they have to, or begrudgingly fulfill a role that needs to be filled out of duty. It's hard enough caring for people, but when you don't really want to do it, it's impossible. Because caring for people is hard, and if you don't want to willingly, actively, eagerly do it, it will turn sour very, very quickly. Because caring's hard, and people make it harder. People make it hard to care for them. Just ask a parent of a newborn baby. You walk out the hospital and they're like, hey, keep that alive. And you're like, oh, okay. And you try and care for them and they won't tell you how to care for them. They scream in your face. Actually, don't actually ask a parent of toddlers or parent of kids, parent of teenagers, actually parent of any parent, in fact, and ask them or talk to them, have you got any experience whatsoever? It's like the idea that you're supposed to care and they make it hard for you to care for them. If you're not in it, like actively, willingly desirous to do it, it's nigh on impossible to do. So Peter says for the church, it needs to be an eager pursuit. Not to get something out of it, but an eager pursuit to actually serve God. Not to lead people to get something out of it, but not to also lord it over them. That idea of lording it over someone very much is the idea that in any sort of spiritual responsibility, you'd see yourself as the spiritual king descending to help the peasants with their weak faith. And it happens. To our difficulty and pain, we know it happens. And all of a sudden, bred in spiritual leadership is an arrogance that says, I'm somehow better than somebody else. So Peter has to say it. He has to say it because if we're not careful, this idea we get in the church is that all the people are here to uphold a man or a woman or this board of directors. And what Peter's saying is that we've got it upside down. These people who say they were going to lead, take responsibility, they're the ones that are supposed to serve the others. They're supposed to care for, they're supposed to carry the weight of responsibility for others. So he looks for and he asks for servants. Servants who would be willing to give the church what it needs, a good example. To lead people by your own good example. And the only good example has been told to us. Jesus himself said it in Matthew 20. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. Any good form of spiritual leadership, spiritual authority, looks like someone who really, really, really wants to be an example of Jesus. Like they want a desire to be so like Jesus that if people were to look at them, if people were to be led by them, if people were to follow them, it's because they actually desire to be like Jesus, not like them. The people would actually watch them, be led by them, and therefore become more like Jesus. Not become a better preacher, not become a better pastor, not become a better parent, not become a better spouse, not become better with their money, but become more like Jesus Christ. And to be like Jesus Christ, what's required, above all, is humility. Is the humility to lead well and be like Jesus. The humility to not lord it over, to not to hold a grudge, to not to try and get something out of it, for it not to be a stepping stone. Really, what Peter's saying is, if you want to be in spiritual leadership, you have to not be like you. Like, don't be like you naturally are. You're going to be something completely contrary and different. You're going to be unnaturally and supernaturally humble if you're actually going to lead spiritually well. And that's designed. God's design is, as we become like Jesus, we can actually care for the church. When we talk about that example of what Peter says and what we just said, that's what we're looking for in spiritual leaders. That's what we need. We don't need the highly talented. We don't need the person doing the next thing different and well and fantastic. We need someone who will care. And so when we talk about overseers at Epiphany Station, pastoral staff, we talk about anyone that's working in any leadership, but especially when we talk church family pastors, people who lead our church families, that's what we're looking for. People with faults and failings, people who do not find themselves qualified, people, not even the best in the world, but people that desire by their good example of following Jesus, being like Jesus, that they could actually care for people, that they could care for them as they choose to submit to him and they follow them. That's what happens. That's what can look like when people get cared for. Then Peter talks about the other side of the coin, not just the people doing the caring, taking responsibility. He then says, and here's what it looks like. Here's what's necessary for those who are going to be cared for. For this to happen, for us to thrive as a church, here's what needs to happen on the other side. He says, in the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. And all of you dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time he will lift you up in honor. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. He now speaks to the younger. He speaks to the newer to the faith. He speaks to actually all those that realize that they need spiritual authority in their lives. Like they need someone. They need someone to care about them. They need someone to want to walk with them, to help them to grow, to help them to change, to help them to transform, to kick sin, to be like Jesus. And I sometimes think that we don't actually believe that we fall into that category. And somehow some need it and some don't. And I think that's where we get it wrong. We sometimes feel like I've been a believer for a long time. There's no way I'm a younger. The idea that you've arrived, the idea that we don't need someone in spiritual authority, I think is what Peter's trying to root out. God opposes the proud. To be able to be cared for, we need to appreciate and accept that there are those we need to care for us. To clothe ourselves in humility. I believe that's God's plan for us. That we would be able to care and to be cared for, but only if we're willing to get rid of the pride that stops both from happening. If that's God's plan, why don't we do it? Like, why don't we want to do it? Why don't we go and pursue and chase, like, oh, I'm hoping that someone would lead me in spiritual authority? I think it might be because we're not the most trusting of individuals, not the most trusting animal on the world, or the most trustworthy. That would be dogs. And on the other end of the spectrum would be cats. We don't trust naturally because we're smarter than that to just trust blindly of people. Because you can see people, and you can actually see that these people who might desire to be in spiritual authority, they're a mess. They've got their sin struggle. The Bible says that they do. Who are they to lead me? Why should I accept authority? Why should I take the risk of letting someone have authority over me? It's an interesting thing that doesn't seem to make sense, but God seems to keep laying it into all the things he creates. Like parenting. He's like, hey, kids, submit to your parents. He says it to wives and says, hey, submit to your husband. And he says it to the church. He says, hey, submit to those in spiritual authority. And for us, untrusting people, we're thinking, this is dangerous. This is incredibly dangerous because what if they cannot be trusted? That only makes sense that we would hand over, that we would offer, that we would invite any sense of spiritual authority. It only really makes sense if God has designed it for our benefit. Not to uphold the one over us, not to bow and to scrape and to grovel and to make them elevated, but if God has actually designed it in a way that that person was given to us to care about us. It only makes sense if verse 7 is actually true. If God cares about you. Imagine that God gave us parents, foster, adoption, grandparents, heck, even older siblings. Imagine if he actually gave us those so that we would be cared about, so that we would know that he cares about. Imagine if God designed marriage in the way that he did so that we could have someone that cares about us because God cares about us. And what would it mean if God had designed the church in such a way that there would be some who were given the role of caring for us because God cares about us? That's actually the plan that he would have, and he would work hard and he would hold to a high level and he would move in humility those in those positions. But then we would get to be cared for. That there would be people in our corner, people who have our backs, people who want us to succeed in this life of faith. I think that's the plan. I think that's the design, that we would then be able to, out of that, care and be cared for. We could have this intimate, vulnerable, family-like connection with people who also want to be like Jesus. And if that's the plan, if that's what God actually designed and wants to see happen, you can start to see how church events are really going to struggle to get that done. Like sitting next to each other in chairs for an hour is not really going to bring about that and manifest. And I don't really know how good the hot dish is, but I don't think a once a month potluck's going to get it done either. I think the way that God designed the church is that we would have, all of us, would have people that we submit to their authority over us, and we're able to be cared for, and then we are able to be caring in there also. That we can admit in humility that I need and that I should care. Let me tell you what this looks like in a little bit of a snapshot of my life. And I realize that I'm a different kind of case, kind of an odd duck, and you're thinking, I finally realized it. But I work at a church, so therefore you can think, well, this doesn't make any sense. But the reason I work at a church is because of this. Because when I first came to put my faith in Jesus Christ, very soon after, I started to see how I felt a lot of people were trying to live their lives and trying to get things done and trying to succeed, and they were doing it without God, and it was failing. And I thought to myself, hey, we should tell them. And so early on in a conversation with God, he told me to care about youth. He told me to care about teens. As a man who's 23, that's probably about all I should try and care for at once. And so I actually approached Epiphany Station. I said, hey, you should give me a job so I can do this. And they said, hey, that's a pretty good idea. And then later on, God's like, I want you to now care for more, and I want you to care for parents and their children. And I said, okay. And then he said, I want you to care for more. I want you to care for all of Epiphany Station, and I want you to care for them in such a way that they will care about those who are not here yet. And all along the line, for me to be able to care for more has been a grueling, painful, purifying process of my pride being scoured out of my soul. There's plenty more to go, but the pride gets in the way of being able to care for people and to love them well. Other side of the coin, not just caring for people, but being cared for. I realized very early after coming to Jesus, I'm going to need some help, because with my background, that narrow path seeming pretty narrow, and the drop-offs pretty deep and steep. And I'm thinking I need people. And sometimes early on we realize we need people, but sometimes then we forget. And so I started very young in my faith, submitting to spiritual authority, inviting people, not just an homogenous idea of it, but actually inviting specific individual people and saying to them, you get to do this. You get to do this in my life. And these are guys called Ben and Jeff and Kevin and Dale and Tim and Gretchen and Steve and Mark and Nolan and Tim and Darren and Pete and my current church family. And you know what? Kind of works. It kind of works when you have people who are all about caring for you. Like you give them that permission and then they do it. It's a beautiful thing. And all along the while, I'm still here because of a lot of those people being willing to care for me. And when I realize it, that I need care, it's a good thing. When I realize and think I don't, it's a bad thing. And it goes bad very quickly. When I don't think I need to be cared for, it usually ends up in a spirited conversation between me and my wife, in which I say, I don't need to talk to them about that. And she says things like, oh, good, finally. You are so perfect that everyone else in the church needs someone to care about them, but you don't. Well done. My wife's spiritual gifts are mercy, compassion, and sarcasm. And that is how God uses her to kind of get through. But that works. It works when we submit to spiritual authority. It works when we actually pick someone and give them that authority over us and say, I need you to care about me. I need you to care for me. But to do it, we have to humble ourselves. And so Peter says, you need to clothe yourselves with humility as you relate to one another, because God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves under the mighty power of God. At the right time, he's going to lift you up in honor. You can give your cares to him because he cares about you. And so the thing that has to happen for church to happen is we have to humble ourselves. The humility to say, I will care for, and the humility to say, I need to be cared for. It's how it's meant to be. There aren't meant to be any of us self-reliant, self-sufficient, just caring for others and not allowing anyone to do that for us. God says he opposes the proud. And he will oppose us in our desire for church, and our desire for friendship, and our desire for family, and our desire for love, if we say, I don't need the church to have a relationship with God. Or I won't care for them. Or I'm in charge and so I can get to do whatever I want. Or the sneaky pride of, I'm fine. I don't need anyone to care for me. God opposes the proud, but he has amazing grace for the humble. With a little humility, God can use you to care for others. No humility, no use. And with a little humility, he can get you cared for by your willingness to admit that you need it. And so really, this is what it comes down to. We want to do this church thing. Like we actually want to do it how it's supposed to be, how God designed it, and generally, in my belief, how it's most needed. And it starts with some people being willing to admit, I'm here to care for others. I'm going to care for them. This isn't about me. It's not what I can get out of it. I'm going to care for them. I'm going to care for them and kind of expect nothing in return. I'm not doing this to get something out of it. I'm just going to do it because I'm eager to serve God. And I'll tell you now, caring for people spiritually often comes back to you in suffering, pain, and hardship. Because people can make it difficult to care for them, not knowing that what they actually want and need is what God has to offer through you. When we talk about church families, we're not talking about, here's the church family and you've got one church family pastor and they're caring for everyone. What we're talking about is a group of people that care for each other. Church family pastors there to make sure that that actually happens, that we don't settle for something less. We are the carers. We were meant to care for other people. We're meant to care for brothers and sisters. We're meant to care for human beings. We're supposed to care about what God cares about. That's what makes us like him. And the idea of caring for someone, maybe God is desirous of you taking some spiritual responsibility over the care of others. Maybe he actually wants you to be a church family pastor. It's not easy. Like you see the list of things that he says, that, and that are not okay. Title hunting, lording it over people, trying to get something out of it, holding a grudge over people while you do it. That's not who he needs. What he needs is servants. He says, I want to care for those people. And by my imperfect example of trying to be more like Jesus, I will help them seek to be more like Jesus. We get to be the ones who do the caring for each other, which is really hard. But in my opinion, the alternative, the next thing, is actually harder. To be willing to be cared for. Hard to care for people. I think it might be harder to be cared for. It also requires a great dose of humility. If you go to church family and you're like, I'm so happy I'm there for these people, you're doing it wrong. That's not church family. You're not there for them. You actually become a family when you let them care for you. When you open up and invite them and show them that there are pieces of you that need to be cared for. And if you're thinking to yourself, I don't need to be cared for, then the next step in your spiritual maturity and growth is to go and talk to your God about the pride that is within you that he needs to get out of you. Because all of us need to be cared for. None of us are perfected. None of us have arrived. And so when we talk about this, I just want to make something abundantly clear. We talk church families. It's not like, hey, lucky for you, Epiphany Station has worked it all out and the church has been trying to work this out for 2,000 years, but we've got it, yay. It's not trying to get you to be part of a ministry. It's not trying to pad numbers or serve our ego. We talk about church families and them being where church happens because we believe that God cares about you. And that is where you will be cared about far greater than anything else we have to offer. And that is where you have an opportunity to care for each other far greater than events that we can put on. And so church family might be right for you. It also might be something different. It might be something that you want to create. Maybe 2 of you, 3 of you do something very, very different to what I'm talking about, but you're caring for each other and being cared about. That's great. Do that. Maybe this inspires you to look at your home and how you lead it in a desire to care for your children and your spouse far greater than you ever did. And if that's the result of this, perfect. That's phenomenal. Church family is just something that we offer. Something that we think is good. Something based on God's original intent for how the church was created right after Christ left. Something that Peter's talking about of what it would actually look like and be. And that if we humbly stepped into it, would benefit every single one of us. But what we need is God-led humility. God-led humility to both care for people and to be cared for. In a second here, Andy's going to come up and he's going to give you some, hey, if you want to be in church family, let's talk about it. Here's how you can do that. But I just want to make sure that you understand that whatever God leads you to do today, as he will speak to you and tell you, here's the next move. Less pride, more humility. Less you, more me. Respond to that. Actually follow that. Don't let that be something that you buck against, but let him lead you, because what he would lead you in will be far better than what you would lead yourself in. Let me pray for us, and let me pray that we would be able to do this humility thing. Let me pray that we would believe that God knows best. And so whatever he would say and whatever he would lead us to, we would do that. like we believe it to be best. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you that your desire, your great desire, is that we would not be isolated and alone, that we would not find ourselves in the dark, no one caring about us, and that we would find ourselves not useless, but having someone to care for. The design of your church means that there is place for every single one of us at every stage of our lives, when we're ready to give and pour out and to care, and when we just need someone to care for us. You've designed it in a way that there'll be people ready for both. And so we ask that we would be the church that you desire us to be. We ask genuinely that as individuals, you would take out any pride that stops us from wanting to care for the people you call us to, or any pride that would make us imagine that we don't need to be cared for. We ask for the pride to be gone and the humility of Christ to come within so that we would be able to be your church. We ask you to move us in the most supernatural of ways that will maybe show in the most natural, normal ways of us loving each other and being your church. We ask you to do this because we want to glorify you. We want to do this in Jesus' name. Amen.